It was supposed to be a normal day in the air. The sky was clear, the sea below calm, and the hum of the engines filled the cockpit with a steady rhythm. The pilot leaned back slightly in his seat, glancing out the wide window as the endless blue stretched beneath him. Flying over this region was routine for him. He had done it hundreds of times before, but that day something small and strange caught his eye, a patch of white on an island that should have been completely empty. At first, he thought it was sunlight reflecting off rocks or waves. But then, as the plane drew a little closer, the shape became clearer. The white marks on the ground formed letters. Big letters. He blinked hard, his eyes narrowing. There was no mistake. The letters spelled SOS. A chill went through him. It was the kind of thing you might read about in old stories of shipwrecks, not something you expect to actually see with your own eyes. He quickly checked his navigation map. The island below was marked as uninhabited. According to official records, no one lived there, and no planes or ships were supposed to be near that area. He looked again. The letters were huge, made with something that stood out against the sand, probably stones or pieces of coral. Whoever made them wanted to be seen. He immediately grabbed the radio. "Control, this is Flight 47. I'm reporting possible distress signals on a small island at coordinates 24.9 north, 156 east. Large SOS markings visible from air, requesting confirmation if any known activity in that area." The air traffic controller's voice came through, calm but puzzled. "Flight 47, please repeat. Did you say SOS markings?" "Affirmative," the pilot said. "Clear letters, possibly recent." There was a pause. The controller replied, "Stand by. That island should be uninhabited. No known activity reported." The pilot's heartbeat quickened. He could have just flown on, left it to someone else to check, but something inside him said this couldn't wait. There was a feeling, a sense that someone might be out there waiting, desperate for help that had never come. When he landed hours later, the image of those white stones wouldn't leave his mind. While other passengers moved on with their day, he went straight to the small operations office and showed them his flight path and what he saw. He even sketched out the shape of the letters from memory. Most people in the room looked doubtful. One official suggested it could have been leftover markings from a military drill. Another said maybe it was a prank by tourists or fishermen, but the pilot wasn't convinced. The letters looked too carefully arranged, too deliberate. He told them, whoever did that was trying to survive. Those letters weren't made for fun. Eventually, his persistence worked. The Coast Guard agreed to send a small team to the area. A helicopter was scheduled to fly out the next morning. The pilot couldn't go, but he stayed in touch, asking for updates as if he somehow felt responsible. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about that island, how empty it looked, how quiet, and yet how clearly it carried a silent cry for help. He wondered how long those letters had been there. Days, weeks, maybe even years. He imagined someone standing on that shore waving at the sky, hoping for a plane to pass by. The thought was enough to make his chest tighten. The next morning, as the rescue helicopter lifted off, the pilot watched from the base, his eyes following it until it disappeared into the horizon. The flight took nearly 2 hours. The island wasn't far in distance, but it lay in a lonely corner of the ocean, where few ships ever passed. When the rescue team arrived, they began circling low. From above, they could see the same markings, still bright and visible. The pilot hadn't been mistaken. The SOS was made from white stones arranged carefully on a patch of sand near the tree line. They decided to land on a small flat area not far from the markings. As the helicopter touched down, the sound of the rotors stirred up clouds of dust and leaves. The men stepped out carefully, scanning the surroundings. Everything was still, too still. The place looked like something frozen in time. Palm trees swayed gently, and the air was thick with the smell of salt and earth. There were no people in sight. But not far from where they landed, they saw footprints. Fresh ones. They followed the trail and soon came across something even stranger, a small camp. There was a fire pit, long burned out with bits of charred wood. Around it, they found a few personal items, an old backpack, a couple of plastic bottles, and what looked like a piece of clothing hanging from a branch. One of the team members knelt to inspect the ashes. "This wasn't long ago," he said quietly. "A few days, maybe less." They looked around, calling out, but only the sound of waves answered. It was eerie. Someone had clearly been here, but where were they now? The team split up to cover more ground. They moved through the dense brush, checking the edges of the island, but the place seemed empty. Then one of the rescuers called out. He had found something carved into a tree. The words were rough but clear, still waiting. Help us. For a long moment, no one spoke. The message sent a chill through everyone. It confirmed what they already feared. Someone had been stranded here, possibly for a very long time. They decided to search the entire island before returning. The place wasn't big, maybe a few miles across, but thick vegetation made it hard to move fast. They found traces of human life everywhere. A makeshift shelter built from branches and leaves. A few shells arranged neatly in a circle. Even an old tin can rusted from rain. In one corner of the shelter, they found a torn notebook wrapped in a piece of plastic. The writing inside was faded and smudged, but some parts were still readable. Short sentences, lists of things to do, notes about rainwater and fishing. One line read, "Plane passed today. No signal." Another said, "We will keep trying." It became clear that whoever lived there hadn't given up easily. They had tried everything they could to stay alive. The rescue team spent the entire day searching, calling, and checking the shoreline, but by sunset, they had found no one. It was as if the people who made the SOS had simply vanished. Before leaving, they took photos of everything, the markings, the campsite, the notebook, and marked the coordinates carefully. They left behind food and water, just in case someone returned. When they got back, they reported everything to the authorities. News spread quickly. The island, once thought to be empty, might have been home to survivors of a lost ship or plane. Reporters began to call it the SOS Mystery Island. The pilot listened to every update. When he saw the first photos, he felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that he hadn't imagined it, that his decision to report it had been right. Sadness because the more he heard, the clearer it became that someone had been asking for help for a very long time. And no one had noticed until now. Investigators started digging through old records. They checked for any missing ships, small planes, or reported disappearances in that region. Soon they found something. A 2-year-old report about a missing small boat carrying 4 people. The search back then had covered several areas but never reached that tiny island. The thought that those markings might have been there all this time made everyone uneasy. How many times had planes flown over without seeing them? How close had help been without realizing it? For the pilot, that question became personal. He replayed the image of those letters in his mind over and over again. It wasn't just random stones. It was someone's last hope spelled out in desperation. As days went by, more information began to surface, and investigators planned another mission to the island, this time with more equipment, hoping to uncover who had been there and what had happened to them. The pilot knew it was only the beginning of something bigger, something that would soon reveal a story no one was prepared for. That night, before heading home, he stood outside the hangar, looking toward the dark ocean. Somewhere out there beyond the horizon, that lonely island sat in silence. The SOS might have faded a little in the sun, but its meaning would never fade from his mind. Someone had reached out to the sky for help, and he had been the one to see it. He whispered quietly to himself, "I hope we're not too late." The sound of waves and wind filled the silence, as if the ocean itself carried unanswered questions. But deep down, the pilot knew the truth was still waiting on that island, buried somewhere in the sand and shadows, waiting for someone to finally uncover it. The next morning, the rescue team prepared to go back to the island. This time, they were joined by 2 investigators and a few local volunteers who knew how to search rough terrain. Everyone was curious, but there was also a quiet tension in the air. Nobody knew what they were about to find. The pilot who had first spotted the SOS stood near the helicopter as it was being fueled. He wasn't part of the team officially, but he came just to see them off. He wanted to make sure they were really going back. Before they left, one of the team members told him, "We'll find out what really happened there." The pilot nodded, though his face stayed serious. He could still picture those white stones and the silence that surrounded them. The helicopter lifted off just after sunrise. The sea below glimmered like glass, and small waves broke against the empty islands scattered across the horizon. From above, it looked peaceful, but everyone inside the aircraft knew that peaceful didn't always mean safe. As they approached the island, the same sight appeared. The white SOS, the small stretch of sand, and the dense green trees that seemed to guard the place. The pilot had described it perfectly. The team decided to land again in the same open area. Once the rotors slowed and the noise settled, all that was left was the sound of the ocean wind. The first thing they noticed was that nothing had changed since their last visit. The stones were still there. The makeshift camp still looked untouched, but now in daylight they could see more details. The ashes in the fire pit looked newer than before, as if someone might have been there not too long ago. Maybe they came back, one of them said quietly. Another replied, or maybe we just missed them last time. They began by taking photographs and marking each clue carefully. The footprints they had seen before were harder to find now, washed away by rain or waves. Still, a few faint tracks remained near the trees. The same words were carved on the trunk, still waiting. Help us. The letters looked rough, made with something sharp, maybe a knife or stone. While half the team stayed near the beach, the others went deeper into the island, following a narrow path through tall grass and low shrubs. It was hard to move fast. The heat was strong and insects buzzed in the air. But they kept going, guided by curiosity and a sense of duty. After an hour of walking, they reached a small clearing where another shelter stood. It was even more carefully built than the first one, with palm leaves woven together to keep out the rain. Inside, they found a few more belongings, a broken flashlight, an empty can of beans, a water container made from a cut plastic bottle, and a short piece of rope. Everything looked worn, but it told a clear story. Someone had lived here for a long time. Then one of the rescuers found something that made everyone stop, a small piece of paper tucked under a rock. It looked like a note faded by moisture. The handwriting was shaky but readable. It said, "If anyone finds this, we were here. Please tell our families." The note had a date written on it almost 2 years ago. That single detail made everyone silent. 2 years. Whoever had written it had been trapped here for that long, or maybe longer. They radioed back to the helicopter and shared what they found. One of the investigators said, "It matches the timeline of that missing boat. The one that disappeared 2 years ago. That missing boat had carried 4 people, 2 adults, a teenage boy, and a local sailor. Their story had once made headlines, but after months with no sign, the world had moved on. Now, it looked like they had ended up on this very island." Back at the beach, the rest of the team continued exploring near the shore. They found more evidence, a small fishing net made from twisted rope, a line of shells set in a pattern, and what looked like a half-finished raft made from driftwood. It had started to fall apart, but you could tell someone had tried to build it. When both groups met again, they shared what they found. Slowly, a picture began to form in everyone's mind. The survivors had been stranded, built shelters, collected food, and even tried to escape. They must have held on for as long as they could. The team decided to check the other side of the island before leaving. It was smaller and rockier, with cliffs overlooking the sea. They split into pairs and followed the coastline. It was dangerous, sharp rocks, slippery ground, and waves crashing below. After climbing a small hill, one of the rescuers called out. He had spotted something strange. From the top, you could see a faint trail leading down toward the rocks. It looked like someone had carried heavy objects there. When they followed it, they discovered pieces of wood and rope scattered along the path. It was part of the same raft they'd seen earlier, but here it was broken apart completely. Standing there, looking out at the endless ocean, they could imagine what must have happened. Maybe 2 of the survivors had tried to leave, hoping to find help, but the sea had been too rough. The idea made everyone's chest tighten. Before heading back, they searched one last time around the area. Near the base of the cliff, among the rocks, they found something small, a necklace. It was simple, with a tiny shell pendant. One of the investigators picked it up and said, "This could belong to one of them." He placed it carefully in a plastic bag to take back for testing. By late afternoon, the team returned to the helicopter, exhausted but thoughtful. They had enough evidence to confirm that people had survived here, but the question remained, where were they now? When they returned to base, the pilot was waiting. He had stayed the entire day, pacing near the communication tower. As soon as he saw them, he asked, "Did you find anyone?" One of the rescuers shook his head. "Not yet. But they were definitely there. They left signs, notes, everything. Looks like they were alive for a long time." The pilot's shoulders sank a little, but he seemed relieved that at least the truth was starting to come out. He listened carefully as they described the shelters, the message on the tree, and the broken raft. When they showed him the note that said, "Please tell our families," his eyes softened. 2 years, he whispered. All this time, the following days turned into a storm of investigation. The local authorities brought in forensic experts, map analysts, and survival specialists. They wanted to piece together how the survivors had ended up there and why nobody found them sooner. The pilot gave his full report, including every detail he remembered from the moment he first saw the SOS. Photos from the island spread quickly through the media. People everywhere were shocked. The images of the SOS letters, the handmade shelters, and the lonely beach became symbols of survival and hope. For many, it was hard to believe that in the modern world, someone could still be stranded on an island for years without being rescued. As experts analyzed the clues, new details began to appear. The notebook that the team had found on their first visit was sent to a lab. They were able to recover several pages that had faded. The handwriting revealed small but powerful details. The survivors had caught fish, collected rainwater, and even marked the days with scratches on a piece of wood. The last entry in the notebook read, "We can't wait anymore. Going to the other side tomorrow." That line changed everything. It proved that they hadn't given up. They had tried to save themselves. The authorities decided to organize one more mission to the island, this time with more people, drones, and equipment to search every inch. The pilot once again offered to assist in coordination. He said he wanted to see it through to the end. He had been the one to find the SOS, and he felt connected to the people behind it even though he had never met them. That night, he sat alone in his small apartment looking out at the stars. He imagined what those survivors must have felt, looking up at the same sky, waiting for a sign of hope. He thought about the words carved on that tree, "Still waiting." It echoed in his mind like a whisper from across the sea. Somewhere deep inside, he knew this story wasn't finished. The island had given up its first secrets, but the truth was still hiding somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. Maybe it was buried in the sand, maybe written in another note, or maybe carried away by the waves. For now, all he could do was wait, just like they once did, and far away. On that small, lonely island, the white SOS still stood out under the sun, a quiet message that refused to disappear. It was more than just a cry for help. It was proof that someone had fought to live even when no one was watching. Days passed, but the mystery of the island stayed on everyone's mind. The images of the SOS letters had spread everywhere, and people kept asking who those stranded souls were and whether anyone had ever tried to save them before. The story had become a headline, but for the pilot who first spotted the markings, it was much more than a story. It was something personal now. He found himself checking the updates every morning. Each new piece of information made him more restless. There was a part of him that needed to know the full truth, to understand what had really happened on that small, forgotten island. A week later, a new search team prepared to return to the site. This time the operation was bigger. They brought drones, sonar equipment, and even forensic experts to make sure nothing was missed. The pilot joined the control group, helping them trace coordinates and organize the route. The helicopter lifted off early in the morning, carrying the team and all the gear. The pilot stood on the ground looking up as it disappeared into the clouds. He felt a strange pull, as if part of him was flying along with them. When the team reached the island, the weather was calm. The same wide beach stretched out before them, quiet and empty. They began setting up equipment immediately, determined to uncover everything the place had been hiding. The first drone flew over the tree line, capturing images from every corner. On one side of the island, near a rocky hill, they noticed something unusual. What looked like a second shelter, much larger than the first two. The team decided to investigate. As they approached, they saw signs that this one had been used for a longer time. There were small piles of shells, dried seaweed, and pieces of driftwood stacked neatly as if for firewood. Inside they found more belongings, a torn piece of cloth, a rusted knife, and a few empty containers. But the most surprising thing was what they found hidden beneath a flat stone near the shelter. A small camera, covered in dirt and rust. Its lens was cracked, but the body was still intact. It looked like it had been buried on purpose. Everyone gathered around it. One of the rescuers said quietly, "This could tell us everything." They handled it carefully, putting it inside a protective bag. It would be sent back to the lab later for data recovery. Not far from the shelter, another team found something else, footprints leading toward the north side of the island. The prints looked smaller, lighter, maybe from a teenager or a young adult. The trail disappeared near a group of rocks, where they discovered a few more objects. A fishing line made from thread, and a small piece of driftwood carved with marks. It was becoming clearer that there had been more than one person here. The signs showed cooperation, shared work, effort, survival. But something had happened later that changed everything. By evening, they gathered all the items they'd found. Among them was a notebook, hidden under a pile of stones near the second shelter. It was wrapped carefully in plastic and surprisingly well preserved. The handwriting inside was faded but readable. The first few pages described the storm that had brought them to the island. According to the notes, their small boat had been caught in heavy rain and high waves. They had tried to stay afloat, but the current dragged them off course. When they finally reached land, their boat was broken, and they had no way to contact anyone. As days passed, they built shelters, searched for food, and tried to signal passing ships. They wrote about the struggle to find clean water, the heat and the loneliness. Despite everything, the tone of the writing showed hope. They believed help would come, but as the pages continued, the words began to change. The handwriting grew messier. One entry said, "We saw a plane today, but they didn't see us." Another read, "The storms keep coming. Supplies are gone." Later pages hinted at something else: illness, exhaustion, fear. The final page stopped mid-sentence saying, "We'll try to reach the other side tomorrow." Everyone stood silent after reading it. They realized these were the final words written by one of the survivors. The items were carefully packed, and the team decided to stay one more night on the island before returning. They set up small tents near the beach. As the sun went down, the air grew still and the sound of waves filled the silence. One of the rescuers said softly, "It's strange, isn't it? You can almost feel like they're still here." The next morning, they explored the northern side, where the journal mentioned the other side. The terrain became steeper, covered in rocks and thick bushes. After climbing for nearly an hour, one of the drones hovering above sent an alert. Something unusual was showing near a shaded clearing. They hurried there, moving carefully through the uneven ground. When they arrived, they saw what the drone had spotted. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall trees, with two low mounds of sand and coral stones carefully arranged on top. Everyone stopped. They already knew what it meant. The team lead stepped forward and examined the spot. It was clear that someone had taken care to make these graves. The stones were smooth, placed neatly, and a few shells were laid on top like a marker. Nearby, they found a small cross made of driftwood tied with rope. For a moment, no one spoke. The quietness felt heavy. Even the waves seemed distant. The realization hit them. They had found where two of the survivors had been laid to rest. They documented everything, taking photos and marking the exact coordinates. DNA samples would later confirm the identities. When the team returned to base that evening, everyone looked drained. They had uncovered answers, but the truth was painful. Two of the 4 people who had once fought to live on that island hadn't made it. At the base, the pilot was waiting again. He could tell from their faces that they had found something serious. One of the investigators told him about the graves and the notebook. The pilot lowered his head, his hands tightening into fists. "At least now we know," he said quietly. "At least they won't be forgotten." Later that night, technicians began working on the damaged camera. It took hours to clean and repair the memory card. Everyone gathered around the computer as the first few images loaded. The photos were grainy but clear enough. They showed 4 people, a man, a woman, a young boy, and another man who looked like a sailor. In the early pictures, they seemed determined, smiling weakly as they built their shelter and gathered supplies. The surroundings matched the island perfectly, but as the photos continued, the expressions changed. The smiles faded. The faces grew thinner, more tired. You could see the passage of time, the growing beards, the sunburned skin, the desperate eyes. The final few images were haunting. They showed only 2 people left, the sailor and the boy. The others were gone by then. In one photo, the boy was staring toward the ocean, holding what looked like a piece of wood shaped like an oar. The sailor was beside him, pointing out to sea as if explaining something. That was the last picture. No more after that. The room fell silent. The pilot stood near the back, staring at the screen. He imagined how those last moments must have felt, the decision to leave, the fear, the faint hope that maybe they would make it. The next day, the investigation team officially announced the discovery. They confirmed that the SOS markings were made by the same missing group from 2 years ago. 2 of them had been found buried on the island, and the remaining 2 were believed to have tried to escape on a raft. The news spread fast again. People all over the world watched the images, the graves, and the small island that had held such a powerful story. Many called it a tragedy, but others saw it as a story of strength and human endurance. For the pilot, it was both. He visited the Coast Guard base once more, standing by the window that faced the sea. He didn't say much. He just watched the horizon, the same direction where the island lay, thinking about the people he had never met but somehow felt deeply connected to. He knew there were still unanswered questions. What happened to the boy and the sailor after they left? Did they ever make it to another island? Were there traces left somewhere that no one had found yet? He hoped that someday those answers would come too. But even if they didn't, he felt a quiet sense of peace knowing that his eyes, that one moment of attention during his flight, had brought their story back to light. The island, once forgotten, had finally spoken, and though its message had come too late to save them, it had reminded the world that sometimes the smallest sign, a few stones spelling out 3 letters, can carry the weight of a lifetime. The days after the photos were released were filled with questions, memories, and emotions. People wanted to know more about the ones who had lived on that island, what their final days were like, and why no one had found them sooner. For many, the story had become more than a mystery. It was a reminder of how fragile life could be when the world stops looking. The pilot couldn't stop thinking about the faces in those photos. Every image told a story, the way the woman smiled weakly as she held a small fish, the tired look in the man's eyes as he stood beside a broken raft, the boy's determination as he helped carry wood. Even the sailor, whose face showed calmness despite everything, seemed like someone who refused to give up. Investigators kept analyzing the items found on the island. They studied the notebook again and managed to read more with advanced tools. The last few pages revealed small details that no one had noticed before. One line said, "We made a promise to stay strong no matter what." Another read, "If help doesn't come soon, we'll try the sea again." The mention of again caught everyone's attention. It meant that they had already tried to escape once before. That could explain the broken pieces of the raft scattered along the shore. Experts believed that after losing 2 of their group, the boy and the sailor must have rebuilt the raft, trying one last time to leave the island. But no one knew if they ever made it. The pilot spent his evenings reading every new report, each small discovery feeling like a piece of a puzzle slowly coming together. He couldn't explain why this story affected him so much, but deep down, he knew it wasn't just about curiosity. It was about humanity, the will to survive, the courage to hope even when the world goes silent. One evening, as he sat by the hangar watching the sunset, a journalist approached him for an interview. She asked what it felt like to be the one who first noticed the SOS. He took a deep breath before answering. "At first I thought it was nothing, just rocks or shadows, but something made me look again. Maybe it was luck, maybe it was fate. I don't know. But when I realized it was an SOS, it didn't feel like luck anymore. It felt like a voice calling out, asking to be heard." His words later appeared in newspapers, and many people said it was the most human part of the story, the connection between the one who saw the signal and the ones who made it. While the world talked about the pilot's discovery, the investigation team returned to the island one last time. They wanted to make sure no clue was left behind. This time they brought underwater search drones to check the surrounding waters, hoping to find traces of the raft or anything else that could explain what happened after the survivors left. The weather was calm when they arrived. The sea was clear enough to see the coral below, glowing faintly under the sunlight. The drones were sent down, slowly scanning the ocean floor. For hours there was nothing but sand, coral, and fish. Then near the edge of the reef, one of the monitors showed something different. A piece of wood, curved and weathered, caught between rocks. When the divers went down to check, they found more pieces nearby, fragments of a raft, rope, and even a small metal hook that might have been part of their fishing gear. Everything was covered in algae and barnacles, proof that it had been there for a long time. The discovery confirmed that the survivors had indeed set out to sea. But where they went after that, no one could tell. The ocean had kept its secrets. Back on land, the analysis continued. One of the most emotional findings came from a small rusted box discovered near the graves. It had been missed in the first few searches because it was buried under a layer of wet sand. Inside were a few personal items: a folded photo of a smiling family, a seashell necklace, and several pieces of paper, each written with messages. The words were simple but powerful. "If anyone finds this, please tell the world we didn't give up. We tried to stay strong. We believed someone would come." Those messages touched everyone who read them. They weren't just words from people lost at sea. They were messages of faith, hope, and courage. The pilot read about the box in the reports and felt a lump in his throat. He imagined them writing those words sitting by a small fire, surrounded by the sound of waves. It must have taken so much strength to write something so hopeful in such darkness. The authorities decided to name the island after what the survivors represented. They called it Hope Isle. A small memorial was planned there, not only for the 4 people who had once lived and died there, but for all who had ever been lost and never found. The pilot was invited to attend. He accepted quietly. When the day came, the sky was clear, just like the day he first saw the SOS. A small boat carried him and a few others to the island. As they approached, he saw it again. The same stretch of beach, the same white stones. The SOS markings were still visible, though some had faded from the wind and waves. When he stepped onto the sand, a strange feeling washed over him. The island wasn't just a place anymore. It felt alive, filled with the memories of those who had once called it home. The ceremony was simple. A few people spoke: rescuers, investigators, and even family members of the lost travelers. They placed flowers near the graves, whispered prayers, and stood in silence as the waves rolled gently onto the shore. When it was the pilot's turn to speak, he didn't read from paper. He just spoke from the heart. "I didn't know them," he said softly, "but I feel like I do. They were brave. They were strong. And they didn't stop believing, even when no one could hear them. I think that's what this place is about. Not sadness, but strength. They didn't fade away quietly. They left a message for the world. A message that said, we tried, we hoped, we mattered." Everyone stood silent after his words. The sound of the ocean filled the air, and for a moment it felt like the island itself was listening. After the ceremony, the pilot walked alone toward the place where the SOS markings lay. He crouched down and touched one of the stones. The surface was warm from the sun. He thought about the hands that had placed each stone carefully. One by one, under the burning heat, he whispered quietly, "You were seen." That simple sentence carried everything he wanted to say. When he turned to leave, he noticed something small glinting in the sand nearby. It was a thin metal piece, half buried, like part of a keychain or pendant. He picked it up and realized it was shaped like a small compass. The needle inside was rusted but still faintly visible. It pointed nowhere, but it felt meaningful somehow. He decided to keep it as a reminder, not of tragedy, but of connection. Back home, the story of Hope Isle continued to spread. People began visiting the area, not as tourists, but as a tribute. The island became a symbol of endurance, a quiet place that told a story of those who refused to be forgotten. The pilot went back to his normal flights, but things didn't feel the same. Every time he looked out the window and saw the endless ocean, he thought about how much of it was still unknown, how many stories were hidden beneath its calm surface. Sometimes, when the weather was clear and the route passed near Hope Isle, he would glance down. The white marks could still be seen faintly, especially when the sun hit the sand at the right angle. And every time he felt that same pull in his heart. He often thought about what those people must have talked about during their long days on the island, their dreams, their fears, the things they missed most. He imagined the boy looking out at the sea, wondering if anyone would ever find them, and even though the story had ended long ago, the feeling never left him. Late one night, as he looked at the small compass he had found, he realized something. It wasn't just about survival. It was about being seen, being remembered. Those people had written their story in stones, waves, and words that time couldn't erase, and somehow, by chance or fate, he had become the one to bring that story back to life. as he turned off the lights and looked out at the stars. He thought about the message from the rusted box, the one that said, "Please tell the world we didn't give up." He whispered to himself, "You didn't." And now, everyone knows. The ocean outside was dark, endless, and quiet. But somewhere beyond that darkness, on a small island now known as Hope Isle, the story of courage still lived on, carried by the wind, whispered by the waves, and remembered by everyone who heard it. Months passed since the memorial on the island, but the story of the SOS markings continued to live in people's hearts. What had started as a simple discovery during a routine flight had become something much bigger, a symbol of hope, strength, and the human will to keep going, even when the odds are impossible. The pilot had returned to his normal life, but the story never left his mind. Every time he sat in the cockpit, looking at the endless ocean below, he felt a quiet connection to the people who had once called that lonely island home. The waves that looked so calm from above now carried a weight he couldn't forget. He often thought of them, not as strangers, but as people he somehow knew. One afternoon, while preparing for another flight, he was approached by a woman in her late 50s. She looked nervous but determined. She introduced herself as the sister of one of the men from the photos found on the island. She said she had traveled a long way just to speak with him. He invited her to sit, and she told him everything. Her brother had been part of a small crew that disappeared at sea almost 7 years before the discovery. The authorities had stopped searching after a few months, assuming the ship had sunk with no survivors. The family had mourned, but deep inside, she said, she always felt he was still out there somewhere. When the photos from the island were released, she saw her brother immediately. It was him, the same eyes, the same half-smile he always had when things got tough. The moment she saw his face, she broke down, but not in sadness. She said it felt like a message sent across time, as if he was saying, "Don't cry for me. I fought till the end." The pilot listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. He could see the mix of pain and pride in her eyes. When she finished, she thanked him. "If you hadn't looked twice that day," she said softly, "we would have never known the truth. For years we thought they vanished without a trace, but now I know they didn't give up. That means everything." Her words stayed with him long after she left. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he sat by the edge of the airfield and watched the light fade into the sea. It felt strange how one small decision, to look again, to pay attention, could change so many lives. Over time, letters began to arrive at his address. Some were from people who had lost loved ones at sea, thanking him for reminding them to keep faith. Others were from travelers who said the story inspired them to appreciate life more deeply. He never thought of himself as a hero. In his mind, the real heroes were the ones who wrote SOS in stones, who waited, who kept believing until their last breath. He was just the one who happened to see their message. Still, the more he read those letters, the more he realized something powerful. The story wasn't just about 4 people trapped on an island. It was about everyone who's ever felt lost and kept hoping someone would see them. The story also sparked new research missions. The Maritime Department decided to start rechecking old missing ship cases that had been closed years earlier. They used new satellite scans and technologies that hadn't existed at the time of those disappearances. It was a big step, but it all started from that one discovery. One day, the pilot received a message from one of the researchers. They had found a small uncharted island about 30 miles east of Hope Isle. It looked similar, rocky, covered with thick trees, and untouched by people. What caught their eye, though, were faint patterns along the shore, marks that didn't look natural. They invited the pilot to join the team for a reconnaissance trip. He hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to relive that feeling again, but eventually agreed. Something inside told him he needed to see it for himself. The flight to the area was calm, the sky painted in shades of gold and blue. When they reached the coordinates, he looked down from the window and felt a shiver run through him. There on the sand were more markings, not clear letters this time, but shapes that seemed organized, deliberate. The team landed a few hours later to investigate. The marks turned out to be pieces of wood arranged in a circular pattern. Nearby, they found remains of an old camp, ashes from a fire, a broken fishing spear, and fragments of glass bottles. It seemed someone else had been stranded here too long ago. But unlike Hope Isle, there were no graves, no signs of people, just silence and the feeling that time had frozen. When they dug near the largest tree, they found something surprising. an old metal container buried deep in the ground. Inside was a sealed glass jar wrapped in cloth. When they carefully opened it, they found a note inside, faded and fragile but still readable. It said, "If you find this, know that others were here before you." They left a message on the island to the west. "Tell their story so the sea won't take it." Everyone fell silent after reading it. It meant that even in their struggle, the survivors from Hope Isle had reached out, not just to be saved, but to make sure their story would live on. It was proof that they had tried to leave a legacy, a trail for others who might come after them. They hadn't been just waiting. They were thinking of the future of others who might face the same fate. The discovery made headlines again. Reporters called it the second message. People around the world were moved all over again. Hope Isle became a protected site, and the new island was named Echo Isle, symbolizing how their voices had reached beyond time. The pilot stood there, holding the note, feeling the weight of what those words meant. It was as if their voices had traveled through the waves just to be heard once more. He realized then that this story wasn't just about loss or tragedy. It was about connection, about how one human's voice, even when small and weak, could reach across oceans. That night, as the team camped on Echo Isle, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the shore listening to the wind move through the trees. The ocean glowed faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere out there were the paths those survivors had once sailed, the same waves that had carried their hopes. He thought about the boy from the photos, the way he helped build the raft, his determined look. He wondered if it was him who had written that final note, trying to make sure their story would never be forgotten. The next morning, the pilot helped the team mark the coordinates so the islands could be preserved. Before leaving, he placed the small compass he'd found months ago near the spot where the jar was buried. It felt like closing a circle, returning something that had once been part of their journey. When he got back home, the world had already begun to move on to new stories. But for him, this one would never fade. It had changed how he saw everything, how easily people could vanish, how important it was to notice the quiet things that others might miss. Years later, when he finally retired, he still kept one framed photograph in his study, a view of Hope Isle from above, the faint SOS still visible in white stones. Sometimes he'd sit in front of it with a cup of tea and just look, lost in thought. Visitors who came to see him would often ask about it. He would smile and tell them the story not as a pilot or a witness, but as someone who learned something deeply human from that moment. He would say, "Those letters in the sand, they weren't just a call for help. They were proof that even in the darkest places, people still believe someone will see them. That's what keeps the world going." And as he spoke, his voice would soften, his eyes distant, remembering that day when he looked down from his plane and saw something that changed everything. In time, both Hope Isle and Echo Isle became places people visited not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Schools taught children about the story. Museums displayed the photos and the messages. It wasn't about tragedy anymore. It was about courage and unity. And even though no one ever found out exactly what happened to the last two survivors after they left the island, their story had already done what they hoped. It reached the world. One evening, many years later, the old pilot received a letter with no return address. Inside was a small photograph. It showed a young couple standing near a memorial stone on Hope Isle, holding hands. On the back of the photo were 4 words. They were seen. "Thank you," he smiled as he read it. Maybe it was from a family member, or maybe just someone who understood what the story meant. Either way, it felt right. As he looked at the photo one last time, he whispered to himself, "Yes, they were seen, and they always will be." The wind outside picked up, carrying the faint sound of waves breaking far away. The ocean, endless and deep, still held its mysteries. But now, somewhere within its vastness, 2 small islands stood as proof that even in the middle of nowhere, humanity leaves a mark that time can't erase. And that was enough.